gracias a todas y todos ustedes. Bueno, tenemos el enorme gusto de tener con nosotros a la profesora Jenny Potey. Tengo una semblanza en inglés, vamos a traducirla en la medida de lo posible. Jenny es una profesora distinguida de Sociología y de Salud Pública de la Universidad de Lancaster. Ella ha trabajado tanto como docente, pero también como alguien que ha colaborado en la realización de políticas que tienen que ver con investigación en el Reino Unido. Además, ha trabajado en la zona este de África y Nueva Zelanda, estudiando las determinantes sociales de la salud y las inequidades en el contexto del empoderamiento de la comunidad en acción para poder atender, resolver estas circunstancias. Recientemente, su investigación incluye casos de estudio en comunidades, además de una evaluación longitudinal muy amplia en el Reino Unido, tomando en cuenta la salud comunitaria y el empoderamiento, iniciativas de investigación-acción que desarrollan y evalúan en contextos situados, tomando en cuenta sistemas de resiliencia en barrios y en colonias de muy bajo ingreso. Además de eso, ella es una líder en la investigación, en programas de investigación que van a buscar evidencia o darnos conocimiento para resolver problemas de inequidad mayores en salud. Y esto lo hacen con la English School for Public Health Research. Con sus compañeros de investigación ha producido 3 recursos en línea llamados For Equity, que vamos a compartir también con ustedes más adelante. Es un recurso en línea que apoya a los investigadores para poder fortalecer la investigación dirigida a la equidad. Además de eso, tienen otro toolkit, que es una herramienta, se llama The Neighborhood Resilience Toolkit, que va a buscar apoyar el trabajo basado en la comunidad o en el público. Además de eso, ha estado con diversos proyectos, entre ellos también un proyecto que es una herramienta en línea llamada Involvement Impact Assessment Framework. Este está dirigido a apoyar a los investigadores que evalúan el involucramiento del público en la propia investigación. Además de eso, ella es una asesora de la Organización Mundial de la Salud, además del Eros Health Equity Status Report Initiative, y además ha servido a nivel internacional y en proyectos nacionales en comisiones asociados en las Commissions on Social Determinants of Health. Así que, sin más, y tomando en cuenta pues, este amplio currículum, experiencia y orientación de la investigación cualitativa que parte de la investigación-acción, vamos a dar curso a su presentación. Thank you very much, Jenny, for being with us. We're going to now start playing your presentation. At the end, we're going to have an interaction with the public. Thank you very much.
Buenos días. Primero, gracias por invitarme a hablar con ustedes hoy. En segundo, pido disculpas porque hablaré en inglés. Estoy aprendiendo español, pero muy lentamente para hablar hoy. So, let me begin in English. I will share my screen. So I have been asked to talk about qualitative research and the pursuit of equity, justice and social inclusion. What I want to the presentation will focus on health inequalities and their causes. I will say a little bit about the nature of qualitative research, then how qualitative research can contribute to equity, justice, and inclusion. And then I will give some examples of research that has, I believe, done this. Some of the examples are from my own research and some from colleagues in the UK. And then some concluding thoughts on some of the issues and next steps. So first, health inequalities. We all know that there are differences in the population in the experience of mortality and various morbidity and mental health and well-being. The key point about health inequalities or health inequities, which I would like to stress, is that these differences in health between social groups and between countries are amenable to action. So they're avoidable and therefore they are unfair. As the Closing the Gap in a Generation report from the WHO Commission on the Social Determinants concluded, they are a matter of social justice. They're not random. They're socially determined, and so they can be changed by policy. The images on this slide all give you a very recurring, ubiquitous picture of the gradient from those people who are least advantaged, who have poorer lives, fewer opportunities, and those who are most advantaged. It is a gradient across all societies. But that picture in the top right-hand corner for you, I think, is actually showing you that it's not simply a matter of how much resources a country has. Yes, at every level on that picture, you get a relationship, a strong relationship between the gross domestic product of a country, the income in a country, and life expectancy. But at each level of income in a country, you have a very large difference between those countries that have the same gross domestic product or gross national income. And that's because it's not just how much resource a country has, it's what they spend that money on. Interestingly, the evidence, I believe, in Mexico about health inequalities is not great, but there's been a recent Lancet article, very interesting Lancet article by Adi and Jesus Alegre Diaz, looking particularly at the relationship between education levels and premature mortality in the age group 35 to 70. And education, of course, is one proxy measure of social disadvantage. And what they found was another gradient between people with different levels of education, so that mortality rates were twice as high amongst those with the least educational achievements and those with the most. And they equated it for those with no primary education compared with those with tertiary education to 6 years difference in life expectancy. So there is an emerging literature in Mexico. In Europe, we have a lot of evidence on health, the scale and complexity and extraordinary spread of health inequalities. So what are the dominant stories about the nature and causes of these health inequalities? Well, in the UK, looking at public statements by governments, by academics, by other institutions, research funders, etc., these statements typically focus not on that gradient, not on the fact that at every point in society, as you get less advantage, your health is worse. They focus on the gap. That's the gap between poor people and the rest of the population, or poor places and more advantaged neighbourhoods. So the policy focus, the action focus, is on closing that gap, not shifting the gradient. And in terms of causes, there's a very strong emphasis on lifestyles and upstream social determinants in the statements, in the policy statements, the public statements. These are identified as the causes of health inequality. So smoking, diet, alcohol dependency, but also poverty, poor housing, poor quality employment, etc. And more recently, there's been increasing interest in commercial determinants. So that's the action of the food industry the gambling industry and the tobacco industry, these global institutions that are actually responsible for a very significant burden of ill health. So that's the story you can get, in the UK at least, if you look at public statements. But that isn't the whole story. So these dominant stories, we social scientists call them discourses, which you will see in government policies, in newspaper, on television, wherever you look. They're shaped and maintained by images and actions as well as by words. And in the UK, these images are almost all images about lifestyle and behaviour. They're everywhere. Physical activity, these are some of the policy documents, the pictures on the front. The policy documents are people walking, people exercising, people eating, etc. And that ubiquitous bicycle. One of my favourite images up there on the top right-hand corner is the bicycle with the apple on one wheel, the heart, another wheel, measuring the heartbeat. And there's another one which has a pear or a banana for the handlebars. So although the documents, public statements mention these structural determinants, income, housing, power differentials, actually the story is more about lifestyle and behaviour. And the action, the policies that flow from that are about changing lifestyle and behaviour. And in the last few years in the UK, indeed, it repeats itself whenever we have difficult economic circumstances. A new theme is emerging. That's the power of community assets and community resilience. So the community is increasingly seen as the silver bullet that is going to help fix these health inequalities. There are alternative discourses, but they're more difficult to see and to find. You have to search for these. And one of those, of course, is a political economy discourse, which locates the causes for social and health inequalities in neoliberal economic policies, in the global adherence to free market, in unrestricted capital, unrestricted labour movements, in a restricted role for state welfare, a rolling back of the state, a privatisation of public services, which is happening on a very significant scale in the UK, and the influence of what Graham Scambler has called the oligarchy of the rich. He actually used a much more powerful statement, but the language was not something that I would repeat in this venue. And then there's this other alternative discourse about health inequalities, which I've called the practical wisdom discourse. I'm going to come back to that term. And this discourse, this story about health inequalities, puts at the centre the experience of those, what Bourdieu called, those people who are bearing the weight of the world. And they have knowledgeable narratives about themselves, about the places in which they live and work and the conditions, and about the way the wider structures of our social systems impact on them. And those knowledgeable narratives provide unique insights into the way inequalities work in everyday lives. And these narratives are also a form of resistance, everyday resistance to being told by the dominant stories that you're behaving badly. And it's in the context of this particular public wisdom discourse that qualitative research evidence can promote this way of understanding health inequalities, so comes to the rescue, so to speak. But first, I would like to just say what qualitative research isn't. Now, in this audience, you may be all completely familiar with qualitative research and may not need this warning, but just in case. It is not the opposite of quantitative research. It's not a dichotomy between qualitative research here and quantitative research over there. It's a continuum. So some qualitative researchers do count. We do count. And some quantitative researchers use stories. It's not a way of measuring quality of life. That's a very frequent misunderstanding that I have come across. It's not always small scale. Yes, a lot of qualitative research is small scale because it's very intensive. But actually, one study of clinical decision making and clinical encounters between patients and clinicians by a sociologist called Phil Strong, who unfortunately has died. It's called Ceremonial Order of the Clinic. He had more than 1,000 encounters between patients and doctors in that study. It's not a methods toolkit. It's not just a set of methods. Go and do your focus group, or let's do some interviews. It's a research approach rather than just a set of methods. It is not anything that includes a consumer voice. So if you do a focus group with consumers of services, that's not qualitative research. And it's not the easy option for the non-numerate, for the people who don't like numbers. Qualitative research is an area of expertise which is very challenging for many people to do well. Above all, it is a different way of knowing the social world. And that's what I would just say a little bit more about. So what is this different way of knowing the social? That phrase, practical wisdom, is Aristotle's. So it's been around a long time. And what Aristotle was talking about was the knowledge that we, all of us, develop to make sense of our everyday experiences. And that practical wisdom, that knowledge, that experiential knowledge, is at the centre of qualitative inquiry. What it gives us is a sense of the meaning that people attach to their experience. And Nussbaum, the philosopher, has argued that these meanings are a profound alternative to the scientific, technical rationality currently informing policy and practice. So it's a different way of thinking about the social, that which is currently dominant in evidence-based policy practice. So what does qualitative research do? It explores and interprets people's experiential knowledge in order to illuminate the relationship between people's agency, the way they act, the way they behave, and the social structures around them, the way we structure our society, our social systems. So it asks questions about what do particular experiences mean to people and how are they shaped by social context. My own research, I'm very focused on the meanings people living in very disadvantaged circumstances attach to their experience of disadvantage. But qualitative research can also look at the meanings professionals attach to their experience in hospitals or in community health services. It can look at institutional behaviours and how those institutional behaviours, which of course are the collective behaviours of humans, are shaped by social structures. Qualitative research, importantly, doesn't just describe these relationships and the context within which they develop. It helps to explain why human beings behave the way they behave at the time and in the place that they do that. And it does that in natural settings through theoretical reasoning, not probabilistic reasoning. So theory is what gives qualitative research its explanatory power. So in summary, it's contextually bounded meaning making. That's what we do as qualitative researchers. We meaning make with the people who are involved in our research. So it's a collaborative venture. And it's really important that researchers make their standpoint clear so that the strengths, weaknesses and relevance can be appraised. So it's important that you understand that I am absolutely an advocate for privileging experiential knowledge obtained through very good quality, qualitative research to inform our policies and our practice. And I will be saying more about how I think that can happen. That doesn't mean that I am arguing that that experiential knowledge is right. This is not a question of right or wrong. It's a question of the significance, the relevance of that knowledge for the way we understand the problems social and health problems, challenges that we have to address. So, in summary, how can qualitative research contribute to action for equity, justice and inclusion? I'm going to give you some examples of that, but I would say it does that in 4 ways. It gives voice to people or groups who are frequently not heard or not listened to. People who are marginalised, who are devalued, who are considered to be, at best, uninformed or ill-informed, but at worst, ignorance. It can reframe the way we understand problems, and it reveals the logic of human agency, of their actions and behaviours. It's logical in context. It points to how experience and outcomes of interventions and services can be improved, and it can even point to different solutions, new ways of doing things. And it reveals the politics of social and health inequalities. Virchow argued that health is political 100, 200 years ago. And Latin America has a strong, strong history of recognising and acting on the politics of social and health inequalities. And qualitative research reveals those politics very powerfully. So what about some examples? What about the case of directly observed therapy for the treatment of tuberculosis, DOTS? Again, in the audience here, we probably have quite a few people, if not all of you, who know DOTS, understand DOTS. It's a branded package of interventions which sets up very systematised, regular, consistent access to medication for TB, but it includes observing people taking that medication. And the observers may be clinicians in the community. Occasionally, sometimes, not necessarily occasionally, the observers are in local shopkeepers, they may be pharmacists, etc. There was a Cochrane review in 2006-07 that reported an absence of evidence for or against DOTS compared with people treating themselves. So the argument around that review was that the thing about DOTS that was working was that the supply of medication and the availability of medication, the system for doing that became more reliable. And so that you didn't really need to observe the people, which was a key part of DOTS. You just needed to make the access to services and medication easy. So a colleague and I, Jane Noyce, an academic researcher, undertook a systematic review of qualitative research on what is it qualitative research says about the factors that shape people's help-seeking behaviours in relation to TB. And here's some of the headlines from that. The first thing was that the qualitative research that we included in that review challenged the assumption that the main barriers to help-seeking and compliance with TB treatment are cultural, and that people act irresponsibly. So it challenged the idea that people needed to be observed taking their medication, otherwise they risk not taking it. Instead, qualitative research highlighted other barriers. And a very important one were material barriers, that actually low income, lack of transport, the need to keep working, the difficulty of getting time off work to go and get medication, they were powerful barriers to people either seeking a diagnosis, getting medication, or continuing to take the medication. There were side effects of the TB drugs that could cause problems. So, for example, one of them is the drugs can make people feel hungry. And if you've got a low income, very low income, you can't afford to buy food, then you're not going to take a drug that makes you hungry. And a third and really important issue is stigma. And people with TB experience an enormous amount of stigma within the communities in which they live. So, for example, in some places, young women who are known to have TB have no chance of ever being married. And that's a really important issue. And within services from professionals, TB is still considered to be a kind of dirty disease, a disease that comes from people not looking after themselves. So stigma was a reason why people were not seeking diagnosis and treatment. On the obverse, What qualitative research in this area revealed was how astonishingly resourceful and persistent people could be. They went to great lengths to seek help, despite all of these barriers. So, this systematic review of qualitative research evidence suggested ways to improve directly observed therapy, the DOTS program. It's very clear that what this research is saying is you should be giving more support and less inspection. The observation part of DOTS is stigmatising in time, so if you're going to keep it, you need to do it in a way that is non-stigmatising. You need to think about some of the side effects of the drugs and how they can be ameliorated. And you need to train your health professionals and really address the stigma issue. That's still an important issue. And of course, what WHO did around this time was they introduced something called DOTS Plus, which included, for example, giving out tokens or ways for people to buy food if they were on very low income. So it was addressing some of these issues. Whether there was a direct causal link between this systematic review and DOTS Plus, who knows? But for whatever reason, DOTS Plus is recognising the findings from qualitative research. So that's obviously about reframing the problem, but there's a more direct, there are many other studies about how qualitative research can help reframe problems in ways that mean the way we respond to the problems might be more acceptable and more appropriate. So here's the case of child accidents. In Mexico, of course, child accidents are a major issue. This recent research that was in the newspapers was reporting 3 children killed in traffic accidents every day, and that child pedestrians were at very high risk. Particularly, the report said children walking to school, but also, of course, child vendors at the roadside are at very high risk. And this report identified a very steep social class or socio-economic gradient. So the children from more disadvantaged, from poorer backgrounds, were more at risk of being killed in traffic accidents. In the United Kingdom, we have around 2,000 children under 15 who die or seriously injured on our roads every year. And again, there is a very steep social gradient. So the more disadvantaged the children, the more risk that they will die or be seriously injured on our roads. There is a very strong policy focus on teaching parents and children how to stay safe. More recently, since this research was done, there's also been an increasing focus on slowing down traffic on the roads, so that you now have a big debate, actually, in our cities. Edinburgh has introduced a city-wide 20 miles an hour speed limit, and there is a lot of resistance to that. And in many inner city areas of our other big cities, this is happening. And it's certainly having quite a significant impact on the statistics around the death and serious injury on the roads. When this research was done, which was some years ago, most of the data that were collected were quantitative. This is still the case. They're collected after an accident, and they ask questions like, what were the injuries? What were the consequences of those injuries? What was the treatment for them? So there was then, and probably still is, less information. So questions like, what are the antecedents of the accidents? What was happening before? What might have led to the accident? What aspects of the environment increase or decrease risk? What behaviours of parents and children, yes, but also of transport plans, of architects, policymakers, as well as children and parents? How does their behaviour increase or decrease the risk? One of the women who's done a lot, social scientist who's done a lot of research on child health, Helen Roberts, made this very powerful statement in a book that she published in 1997, and it's still relevant today. She said, not everything that counts can be counted. The really interesting question about child accidents is that given all of the dangers, all of the risks faced by people living in very disadvantaged neighbourhoods, for example. How do so many people manage to keep their children safe in unsafe environments? And she concludes by saying only qualitative data can help us unravel this. So what did one study say? Helen's study. Well, the first thing to recognise is that safety on the roads is just one of the many seamless web of insecurities that people living in disadvantaged conditions face. So low income, poor quality housing, poor nutrition, chronic ill health, unemployment, or really difficult employment. So in this web of insecurities, mothers, for example, trade off one health-promoting behaviour in favour of another. So if they live in very high-rise buildings on the 17th floor with no balcony, they may leave their children unsupervised in their apartments rather than carry them downstairs when the lifts are broken to put washing out to dry. Or they will not allow them in the kitchen. They will leave them alone in another room when they're cooking. So there's a lack of fit between many preventive messages about don't leave your child alone and the realities of keeping children safe. And these safety promotion messages can cause added anxiety. So here's a quote from a mother. To keep the kids safe, you've got them trapped in the house. You're trapped in the house. You're under more pressure, and that causes accidents. Importantly, there was also a mismatch between official and lay or parent perspectives. A couple of quotes to illustrate from a professional, a local government transport planner. I think that the parents perceive that their road is actually very bad. But that's a perception, of course. There is a general perception that cars are travelling faster than they actually are. If you look at the roads and the amount they're used and the complexity of them, they're not really that dangerous. The parent. There are too many cars. When you have parking on both sides of the road, you can't get by. It is dangerous for the weans, the children, Scottish, because they go in between the motors to see if another motor is coming. So your professional is looking at the speed of passing cars, and the parent is looking at the problem with parked cars on the road and how the child sees what's coming on the road when there are so many cars parked. So, here's another example. Understanding what we professionals tend to perceive as risky behaviours. These are all lifestyle behaviours. Eating the wrong food, drinking too much alcohol, not doing enough physical activity. And we still tend to think that these behaviours are a lack of knowledge, or they're just irresponsible. People ignore the knowledge they've got. But what qualitative research tells us is they're not primarily explained by lack of knowledge. They can be logical coping mechanisms, ways to cope with living in very difficult circumstances. So policy and practitioners need to understand that everyday context of behaviours if they want to try and change them. So let's give some examples from qualitative research. Here's a classic, the case of smoking during pregnancies. Policies have tried to stop disadvantaged women in particular from smoking when they're pregnant. And policies over decades have failed to weaken that link between social disadvantage and smoking. There is a very strong social economic gradient. Poor women, marginalised women, are more likely to smoke whilst pregnant than women who live in more advantaged circumstances. And there are consistent findings over time and place from 35 years of qualitative research in 6 countries in this systematic review that was done by Fleming et al. And what were the headlines from this? So, the first headline is that smoking is absolutely embedded in the lives of disadvantaged women. It's a central aspect of their social identity for some. So you're not asking them to just give up a habit. You're asking them to stop doing something that is central to their understanding of who they are. So these women do not lack knowledge about the potential risk to their babies. So they often try to quit temporarily whilst they're pregnant to reduce the risk to the unborn child. It's a temporary quit. So when they return to smoking after pregnancy, it's a resumption to them. It's not a relapse, as we often see it. It's not a failure to quit. It's a success. They have quit temporarily while they're pregnant, and then they smoke again. But quitting completely has very significant costs for these women. It disrupts relationships with partners, with family, with friends, and removes a habit which can help them through difficult times. So smoking is a coping mechanism for many women. And in one of Hilary Graham's studies on smoking amongst poor women, for example, she showed how when they were under enormous stress at home with small children, in order to reduce that stress, they would go into another room, make themselves a drink, have a cigarette, and close the door to where the children were, often, and maybe crying or being difficult. So they were coping, they were reducing their stress and reducing the risk that they might respond to the child's distress in an inappropriate way. So what they try to do, if they can't quit temporarily, is cut down, just reduce the amount they smoke. But this is not a sanctioned alternative by health professionals. They're not happy with the cutting down. And so that reinforces a lack of trust between low-income pregnant women and professionals. And so if those aspects of smoking for disadvantaged women are not built into our policies, then it explains why we've failed to weaken that link between social disadvantage and smoking over many years. So yet another example, the experience of living in difficult places and these behaviours. What we saw there was the experience for disadvantaged women of stopping smoking. But what about, there is a social class gradient, a socioeconomic gradient in smoking anyway, although figures are changing, and particularly amongst young women, young disadvantaged women in the UK, for example, smoking rates are still high. And of course we now have a vaping epidemic, which there is increasing evidence is problematic. So this was qualitative research that was done in inner city areas in the north of England by myself and colleagues some time ago, 20 years ago, but I've done more research like this since. And it was based in contrasting neighbourhoods, affluent neighbourhoods and low-income neighbourhoods. And it asked people what they thought a good place to live looked like. And actually, the people living in the affluent neighbourhoods and in the low-income neighbourhoods shared the same idea about a good place. What is a good place? A good place is where there are good relationships between the people who live there, where there are safe places for children, where there are good places for people to socialise, children to socialise and adults to socialise, where there's access to shops, easy access to shops, where the environment is life-enhancing. But there was a dissonance, a mismatch between these ideas of a good place and the reality of life in the low-income neighbourhoods. So in those neighbourhoods, we identified that people use different types of resources to manage this mismatch, this disjuncture between the places that they think are good places to live and the places where they were having to live. And the material resources were clearly very important. Being able to make their homes comfortable and warm and protect themselves from the outside environment in some ways. Having a car so they could travel to get to shops, etc. They made important use of social resources, friends and families, but often they would need, the friends and families might not live in their neighbourhood, so they would need access to transport to get to those resources. And these resources that we call ontological resources, that's a sense of belonging in a difficult place. So the people who had lived in the neighbourhoods for a long time, who had seen their neighbourhoods deteriorate maybe, who felt that they belonged in this place, were better able to cope with the difficult place that it was than people who had moved in more recently. But these resources, even within poor neighbourhoods, are unequally distributed, and particularly the ontological resource. So some people didn't feel they belonged, and therefore it was much more difficult for them. As this quote from Nicola, who was a lone mother bringing up a child, 3 years old, I think he was, and she says, "The doctor put me on Prozac a few months back for living here because it's depressing. You get up, you look around, and all you see is junkies, as people dependent on drugs. I know one day I will come off. I will get off here. I mean, I started drinking a hell of a lot more since I've been on here. I drink every night. I have a drink every night just to get to sleep. I smoke more as well. There's a lot of things." So this living in these difficult places and not having the resources to compensate for that, it leads to loneliness as she is trapped at home. She keeps her child in, but it can also fuel those behaviours which we see to be health damaging. In this same study, we asked people what they thought caused social and health inequalities. We gave them examples in the poor neighbourhood and the rich neighbourhood of the difference in, for example, deaths from coronary heart disease and deaths from child accidents. And we asked them why they thought there were those differences. It's really interesting to try and understand what causal stories or lay theories those people bearing the weight of the world, to use Bourdieu's phrase, have. And we were surprised, really, at how complex and multifactorial they were. And we identified 3 recurring themes which tell a story. They tell a causal story. So the first thing people talked about was stress, caused by the living in these very poor material conditions, and the social comparisons with people who are better off than they were. So here's a quote it's a typical quote. "It's only obvious that we would not feel health-wise as someone would who has all the comforts and luxuries around them. You know, they go on holidays 3 times a year, whereas we can't afford to go on 1 holiday. Their outlook on life is more relaxed and at ease and comfortable, whereas we are struggling day to day with pressures and to keep up with things." But after they talked about stress, they talked about the response to stress. And recurrently in that context, people talked about the strength of character as being a major way of protecting against the potential damage of stress. So here's a quote to illustrate that. "I think if you have poor housing or are unemployed and don't have a lot of money, you're going to have a different outlook. But I mean, a lot of people think it's more the outside. But at the end of the day, it's what goes on in your own home, what sort of morals and standards and ethics you've got. At the end of the day, it's what sort of person you are. At the end of the day, it's how the individual deals with it all. If you let it get you down, you're going to have health problems. So how strong are you as a person to be able to defend yourself from these difficult circumstances?" So it may sound a little bit like this is a kind of victim-blaming causal story, but actually, almost all of the people that we spoke to, in the end, came back to structural inequalities and a lack of control over those inequalities. I mean, everybody has a bit of worry, but it's our own worry brought on by ourselves. But outside worries that you haven't got any influence on changing, that has a bigger effect on you, I think. You can't sit down and think, well, I've got this problem, and how can I solve it? Because you can't solve it if it's outside your house. It's an outside influence that you can't control. You can't change it. You haven't the power to change it, and it takes over your life. So what's the purpose of these theories? as a qualitative researcher, I'm not arguing that they've got a good theory or a bad theory, or it's the right theory or the wrong theory. I think the important thing about these causal stories is that they serve a purpose in people's lives. They give meaning to their experiences. So here's the qualitative research story from analysing, interpreting that data. These theories that were offered to us by people living in very disadvantaged neighbourhoods. The first thing they do is reconstruct the person's moral worth. To be poor in all of our societies is stigmatising. And so to protect oneself from the label of being poor, being disadvantaged, these theories reconstruct moral worth by arguing that, yeah, it's very stressful to live here, but actually, if you're a strong person, you can protect yourself. And the sociologist Mildred Blackster, who unfortunately has died, she was a wonderful, wonderful sociologist, and her work is worth reading. She says to acknowledge inequality would be to admit an inferior moral status for oneself and one's peers. Hence, perhaps, the emphasis on not giving in. This can be seen to be a claim to moral equality, even in the face of clear economic inequality. So that's the first purpose. The second is that that strength of character narrative reasserts the individual's ability to have control over their lives. So that emphasis on indirect mechanisms, on stress, rather than on low income or poor housing, that's an emphasis on something that people can control by having strength of character. But the third thing that these stories do is reconcile the need for individual control with a recognition of wider injustice. So there's no lack of knowledge about structural determinants amongst the people we spoke to here. They just feel powerless in the face of them. So let me give one last example. And this is an example of how qualitative research can give voice to those who are seldom heard. Now, all of the examples that I've given you have in a way given voice. But the speaker is anonymous. And they're kind of shadowy, because in the end, the qualitative researcher, sometimes with the participation of the people that are working with us, are interpreting multiple stories. So this example is where the storytelling is in the foreground and is not anonymous. So COVID-19 worsened social and health inequalities, but it also worsened knowledge inequalities, or what some social scientists refer to as epistemic injustice. Governments drew on science, they drew on what some governments did. North of you, the government wasn't very great on science, but most governments drew on epidemiology, on biomedical science, on clinical science. But they seldom listened to groups on the front line of injustice. And there are many, in that context, there are many examples where these people who are bearing the weight of the world, Ebola in West Africa, the HIV/AIDS Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa, Indigenous peoples movements in Canada and Australia, People's Health Movement, a global movement. These examples show that the knowledge of the most marginalised, the most disadvantaged, contributes to more effective action and more equitable outcomes if it is allowed to. So in the spring of 2020, in the face of realising that the pandemic was going to worsen inequalities and that it was likely that there would be a lack of opportunity for the voices of those who were most significantly affected by the pandemic, a group of us set up the Other Frontline Global Alliance. And it was an attempt to use storytelling as an act of resistance and to give storytellers from some of the most marginalised communities a sense of control, a small sense of control. So the Other Frontline Alliance recruits and supports a network of community journalists from marginalised groups around the world. It's academics and not-for-profit organisations. Our website hosts their stories, and they are stories of risk, of solidarity, and resistance. There are also stories about positive responses to the difficulties. And they're in written form, video, audio, and photographic form. And whilst the storytellers are posting their stories in their own countries, in their own places, they use these stories to advocate for change with local government and national government. In Italy, it was used, some of the stories were used to try and shape some of the pandemic responses, for example. But the Global Alliance International Editorial Board is also doing research, synthesizing the stories. So using them as qualitative data, experiential knowledge. And one of those syntheses has been published in a very recent WHO guide on equity-proofing policies and interventions, which is shown on the slide here. So, some concluding comments. What I've been trying to show you is some of the ways in which good quality, qualitative research can help us rethink the way we see some of the challenges, social and health equity challenges, make us think more carefully about the way we respond, stop us from immediately looking to lifestyle and behaviour. In that Adi and Jesus Alegre Diaz paper, they focus very much on lifestyle factors. And I haven't read it in any details, but what they looked like they did was control for structural determinants. They had a measure of area deprivation, for example, which took account of income. So they controlled for those things alongside measures of alcohol, exercise, etc., diet. And they concluded that 4/5 of the inequalities between the most and the least disadvantaged in health terms were due to lifestyle factors. And I would say that what qualitative research tells us is not to pull lifestyle and structure apart. You can't do that. These people's lives are clearly telling us that those two separate axes of causes are intimately linked. You can't have one without the other. But qualitative research, this evidence, is still mistrusted. And these are just two quotes, 18 years apart, that are showing us the problem that qualitative research has. So in 2004, Scott Findlay and Pollock, looking at clinical decision-making, argued that attempts to broaden evidence to include experiential knowledge are misguided. Other factors shape clinical decision-making, but confusing evidence with these, i.e. experiential knowledge, has hindered research and improvement of clinical decision-making. I would say there is no evidence that including qualitative research evidence based on analysis of experiential knowledge has hindered research and improvement in clinical decision-making. 18 years later, Kate Pickett, who is an amazing advocate for health equity, very powerful advocate, in EU journals argued that just as a picture can say 1,000 words, a statistic can speak for 1,000 lives. And when we turn away from them to pay more attention to a story, we risk misplaced reactions and responses. I agree with Kate in some ways. She was actually talking about stories in newspapers rather than stories in research, but she didn't draw that distinction. But I would say that if we only focus on statistics, then we risk misplaced reactions and responses. We need to do both. We need to listen to both stories and statistics from good quality research. Brian Wynne, an expert in the public understanding of science, in 2008, but more recently, he said the same thing. He was writing about a foot and mouth epidemic in the UK in agriculture, and he identified as what he called a systematic lack of readiness on the part of what its own practitioners refer to as science to recognise and respect legitimate difference and otherness. So what I would say is, rather than fight paradigm wars, research needs to reproduce a faithful account of a real world, not the real world. There are multiple realities, and we need to understand that complexity. We need to acknowledge that all knowledge claims are contingent on history and culture, not just qualitative research. We need to recognise a multiplicity of knowledges that can illuminate that multiplicity of real worlds. And we need to create more democratic, inclusive knowledge spaces to produce what I would refer to as collective intelligence to inform action. So, some final points. This road sign I found in Australia, only in Australia would you find a road like this. It's pretty obvious, isn't it? It's warning you that the sign has sharp edges and not to touch the edges of the sign. That's the first thing you see. Just like if you read the literature on health inequalities, the first thing you see are numbers, statistics, R values, etc. But look at the detail. Look right down at the bottom there, and this road sign says, also, the bridge is out ahead. And I think that's a kind of metaphor for the problem with qualitative research. If we ignore the outputs from qualitative research, then the evidence base for action to reduce social and health inequities will miss the point. Just like if you don't read this sign very carefully, you'll end up in the river because there's no bridge. Lay people, that's all. This is a treasure trove of evidence that we have and we can continue to accumulate, that we ignore at our peril. But beware. Different ways of knowing about the social world along that continuum, from experimental science to anthropology, are not always complementary. In their defence, qualitative researchers will often argue that what we do is complementary to quantitative. But sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it challenges the findings of quantitative research. And that's really important. There can be major conflicts between these different ways of knowing the social. And they cannot be resolved by just producing more and more evidence. They can only be resolved by dialogue in these new, more inclusive knowledge spaces. I'm not sure I've got time, but I wanted to finally end with one last story, and that's the case of cod's head soup, because I think this amusingly illustrates the politics of experiential knowledge in disadvantaged communities. I was warned not to tell a joke to an audience whose first language is not English, but I've done the joke in Spanish on the slide. So fingers crossed that you will get the punchline. So in England, well, in many countries actually, when we go through difficult economic periods, one of the most frequent responses is to set up cooking classes for people who are living on low income, to teach them how to spend their money more wisely on healthy foods. And in this case, this cartoon, this drawing, is showing you a class. La clase de cocina son una acción frecuente para ayudar a las personas pobres a comer sanamente. Ese día la lección fue sopa de cabeza de pescado. Al final, una mujer preguntó: cuando nos comimos la cabeza, ¿quién se come el pescado? Muchas gracias por su atención.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Do you hear us, Jenny?
Buenos días.
Oh, I'm sorry, let me just
Primero, gracias por invitarme a hablar con ustedes hoy. En segundo, pido disculpas.
Right, I'm sorry for that. Hi, Jenny, thank you very much for this marvelous speech. We want to open now to the audience. If there's anyone here who wants to speak with you, make a comment or a question. So I am going to translate if that's necessary. Vamos a abrir pues el micrófono a todos ustedes. La intención es que podamos hacer algunas preguntas, aprovechando, ya sé que tenemos muy poco tiempo, ya nos comimos un poco del tiempo de la comida, pero creo que es sumamente valioso el que podamos interactuar, así que si existe alguien que quiera hacer algún comentario con respecto a la investigación cualitativa, estos ejemplos que nos hace Jenny con respecto a cómo se utiliza la investigación cualitativa para la implementación de acciones, qué cosas sí son la investigación cualitativa, qué cosas no. Algo que quieran ustedes comentar. Voy a abrir la intencionalidad de preguntar con una pregunta. Jenny, I am going to ask you a quick question. So we are now in an audience of people that want to make research, qualitative research, in the context of medical education. I'm thinking that we have these difficult environments for education generally in the world. We can face violent environments for education. We are facing these situations of mobbing and bullying in the classrooms and also in clinical scenarios. So how can qualitative inquiry can help us to understand this context, and not just that, but also to make an inquiry that gives voice to the people that actually are living or reproducing these violent environments.
It was quite difficult to understand your Caroline. The sound was not good, so I apologise for that. But so I'm not absolutely sure I understood the question. But if it was, how do we? I think qualitative research has a very important role in giving voice to people who either their voices are not heard, or their voices are not they're not listened to. They're not responded to. But so I think it's those participative methodologies that are the ones that will do that. And in my experience, community health workers in particular can do that very, very well. They can do it as part of their work, their everyday work, really. I mean, maybe there's a need for some training in it, because I think sometimes it may not be good enough quality to be able to resist that distrust in qualitative research. So I think probably it's important that people have the right training and support to do it well. But I do think that integrating participative action research in the practice of community health workers, for example, is a really important way of thinking about integrating the external knowledge into practice.
Thank you, Jenny. That was exactly the question. And also, we face as researchers, as qualitative researchers, difficulties with the research committees to approve research. So, what is your experience with that? And if you can tell us a few things about how can you face this challenge of presenting qualitative inquiry research to the scientific community. I'm going to translate my question first to Spanish so everybody knows. La pregunta que le estamos haciendo en este momento a Jenny es, pues, ¿cuáles son los retos que ella ha enfrentado al presentar sus proyectos de investigación ante comités de investigación y cómo ha podido ella resolver esos retos? Entonces, le daremos la palabra al experto, y si ustedes quieren hacer alguna última pregunta, por favor, la hacen y la vamos a traducir. Yes, that was the question.
A good example of the success in doing that is in the Cochrane collaboration. Some of you will have heard of the international Cochrane collaboration that synthesizes traditionally the findings from multiple randomized controlled trials. And Jane Noyce and I, who did the study of tuberculosis dots, we started a network of qualitative researchers within the Cochrane collaboration. And now, 20 years later, that the Cochrane collaboration has qualitative methods group, and the systematic reviews often include systematic reviews of qualitative research. So the learning from that, I think, is that qualitative research, two things I would say. One is that they need to begin to develop networks and relationships together, because it's always more powerful to be a collective rather than an individual. So I think that, people in Mexico that are interested in pursuing, in increasing the profile and the use of qualitative research could, if you don't already have a network of qualitative researchers, I think that would be a good thing to do. And the other really important thing is to set some quality standards. Right? There is just like in quantitative research, I think there's a lot of not very good qualitative research, and a lot of it is very descriptive, and it doesn't use theory to explain things. So I think one of my markers of quality in qualitative research would be, is it seeking to explain agency, human agency, institutional agency? So I think that network could begin to develop some standards that they wanted to use and to share around how do we do really good qualitative research. And then you're better able to defend and argue for its inclusion.
Gracias. Traduzco rápidamente para quien no hable inglés. Entonces, lo que nos dice es, bueno, la experiencia que yo tuve fue justamente con la colaboración con Cochrane. Todos ustedes seguramente estarán familiarizados con esta organización de investigadores que hicieron un estudio, bueno, hicieron cortes de pacientes al interior de Cochrane. Se organizó para hacer una red de investigación cualitativa con colaboración con Cochrane. Y esto permitió posicionar a la investigación cualitativa y posteriormente abrir puertas para mucha más investigación. Nos pregunta, bueno, si nosotros estamos haciendo una red de investigación, tenemos la red de investigación en educación y humanidades en salud y estamos intentando promover justamente el que hagamos investigación cualitativa. Segunda cosa que nos dice Jenny, cuando nosotros presentamos investigaciones de mala calidad, cualitativas, también pues esto es una propaganda en contra del método. Entonces, una de las cosas que se requiere es buscar la rigurosidad y la calidad de la investigación cualitativa. Y en tercer punto, ella decía, uno de los puntos para poder identificar una investigación cualitativa de calidad es que realmente está buscando entender, más que describir, que ay, te lo describí, ahí está la foto de quiero comprender, quiero entender. Durante toda su plática ella nos mostró ejemplos de cómo el entender desde esa perspectiva del contexto social, de ahí de donde se generan las necesidades de salud, las problemáticas, permite emprender acciones que estén, ella dice, informadas. Informed implica el que se basan en un conocimiento profundo de lo que ese contexto te está dando. Entonces, bueno, eso sería parte de la respuesta. ¿Algún comentario que quieran ya para irnos a comer? ¿Algo más? Sí.
Dentro de la experiencia del autor, para la interpretación de datos, ella que recomienda de análisis cualitativos, recomienda alguna. Nosotros utilizamos el Atrasti, pero si ella utiliza algún otro que nos pueda, algún otro análisis, o algún otro software, y además si es o en su práctica lo hacen de una manera interpretativa junto con los investigadores, ¿cuál sería el que le da más efecto o en el que más es su área de expertise? Es lo que me gustaría.
Well, she's asking about the usefulness of software in qualitative inquiry and data analysis, and also if there what's your experience with that, and if you recommend another thing, not necessarily the software, and if you recommend a software, what kind of software?
Well, I am a dinosaur. I'm a dinosaur. I use scissors and sellotape and cards on a very big table. But I do use NVivo, and particularly where I have quite large data sets, then I will use NVivo. But I really like to, I don't like fragmenting the transcripts from interviews into little pieces and themes. But I do think there is now a very strong movement in qualitative research to use software, to use NVivo, for example, and it's partly because it makes the process more transparent, and that's responding to the concerns about the quality. How can we reassure people about the quality of research? And I think that the software that the different programs that are available contribute to that. But there's a part of me that thinks that we're losing a relationship with the data that is quite important to qualitative research. So I suppose personally I would try and use the software. It's very much a thematic analysis program that we have now. There are other ways of analysing data, qualitative data. That's keeping narratives intact, which maybe the software is not so helpful for. So I suppose I understand why people use software, and it's quite an important issue about transparency and rigour. But I personally, I would not want to totally lose the hands-on contact with my data.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I'm just going to translate that last thing, and then we're going to send people to eat because we are already in the break. So let me just translate that. Muy bien. Básicamente la respuesta es, bueno, yo soy un dinosaurio, realmente utilizo mis papeles, mi cinta, lo hago manualmente, sin embargo el software puede ser sumamente útil, por ejemplo, para los otros que te están escuchando cuando presentas tu descripción de cómo lo hiciste. Realmente en este contexto en el que pues, se valora, el que se observe transparentemente cuál fue ese proceso, ¿no? Es esquemático, es transparente, y para algunas personas pueden asociarlo con el rigor de la metodología. Sin embargo, pues hay manera de hacerlo manualmente. Personalmente ella dice que sí ha aportado mucho. NVivo es otro programa que ella ha utilizado mucho, pero entendiendo también que, por ejemplo, para trabajar con narrativas no le gusta romper estos pedazos y de fragmentarlos, y en específico o en especial con las narrativas prefiere ella atenderlo de forma directamente manual, ¿no? Entonces creo que tiene que ver con el para qué queremos el software. Ya no hay mucho tiempo. Yo les agradezco a todos ustedes que hayan esperado todavía a esta hora. We are really grateful to have you here in this international forum.